Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside of the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. My guest today is Danny Haiphong, author with Roberto Sirvent of the new book, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror. I started by asking Danny about himself and how he came to write this book.
I began writing for Black Agenda Report after I graduated from college in 2014, 13, right around that period. And just right before then, I had gone through a political transformation in college. My school was very opulently wealthy, and there were so many issues in regards to racism and class there that really shook me out of my comfort zone in terms of I had grown up in a working class background, and things like racism and exploitation were kind of normalized to an extent. And so when I went there, I got to see, well, who the class enemy really was. And I began to do activism around it. And that led me to experiences like coming here to New York City in 2011 for a union semester program. Occupy Wall Street was happening. And there was just a lot of conversation about socialism and what's going on with the labor movement. And I got to learn a lot about the contradictions of U.S. society through that experience. And so in 2011 was also a critical period for me because in 2008, given that a lot of working class families in the East Coast are Democratic Party affiliated, I had grown up in a Democratic Party family, at least on my dad's side. And I voted for Obama in 2008. But then when Libya happened in 2011, as I was going through this experience in Occupy Wall Street, I began to realize that no one was talking about war and peace. This question was basically ignored by Occupy Wall Street in large part, but also just by the broader labor movement and the broader struggle for social justice in this country. So when I started to examine the fact that this Democratic Party so-called black president was bombing an African country, the most prosperous African country on the continent, I began to learn all sorts of things about what was going on in Libya because I was so curious. I never even heard of it before. Most people that I knew didn't even know where Libya was on a map. So I became really curious about this phenomenon. And that led me to Black Agenda Report. And I found that Black Agenda Report was the only left publication, or one of the few at least, that were really critical of Barack Obama and what that presidency really meant. So I began writing for them in 2013-14. I've been writing for them ever since. I've been writing for them weekly now for several years. And I was contacted to write this book by Professor Roberto Sirvent in Southern California. And he had the idea, and he said, look, we need Black Agenda Report's voice in this book. And he asked if I would participate in it. And I said, sure.
So this book is called American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror. First of all, American exceptionalism is something that I think a lot of people, particularly on the left, have some idea about. Let's talk about what your definition is of American exceptionalism and American innocence and why you put them together.
So our definition, we think, broadens our understanding of its function and its role in terms of perpetuating war, white supremacy, capitalist exploitation, and we define it as both of them as ideologies of the ruling system in this country, but the global system of imperialism worldwide that's led by the United States at the head. And we frame the discussion as these ideologies really reinforce this notion that the United States is a force for good in the world. So that's American exceptionalism. And this has been repeated verbatim over and over and over again throughout the history of the United States, dating back to the origin story that the U.S. was founded upon a progressive revolution to overthrow British tyranny, all the way up until today. And we saw this a lot in 2016, especially in the Hillary Clinton campaign, where she was very forthright in saying that the United States was the city on a hill and was already great, as opposed to Donald Trump's moniker that the U.S. Needed to be made great again. So our definition of American exceptionalism is the offensive ideology, the ideology that says that the U.S. is a democracy, that the U.S. is the most advanced society that has ever been developed, that it is a civilizing force around the world, and it is heavily influenced by the broader framework of Western liberalism. And then American Innocence, on the other hand, is the defensive posture of the ruling class and a lot, especially white Americans, who want to defend the claim of American exceptionalism. So American Innocence basically says that while the United States has made mistakes, and if you bring up a critique like the United States was responsible for the death of over 1 million Iraqis during the Iraq War, for example, then someone like Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, will say that it was worth it because at the end of the day, there was a broader mission and the intent was good. That there was a good intention behind the fact that the U.S. needed to overthrow the government of Iraq because the government of Iraq was less superior, was not civilized, and was barbaric and committing crimes against humanity, so on and so forth. So that's basically how we define it. And we take a more historical lens and a more critical lens in relation to just various phenomena that have occurred over the course of the past several centuries. And we try to show that this ideology is not only rooted in these systems of oppression, but also that this ideology is very seductive and effective and shows up in all sectors of society and even in all of our struggles for social justice and liberation, as we conduct them and organize them, and that we have to approach them head on.
You cover some high points or perhaps low points of U.S. history in the book, but you're telling the history from a completely different perspective than we are accustomed to hearing it. And the other thing that I notice here is that there is a far greater emphasis on the racism, the violence, the settler colonial aspect of our founding, the things that we tend to want to see as aberrations rather than as fundamental values and features of our society.
That was really the impetus behind writing the book, because at this moment there's so much happening, right? We have the Sanders so-called the Sanders insurgency in the Democratic Party, where a lot of especially young people are fed up with what the Democratic Party has been doing for the last 30 or 40 years. That has deeply affected the future of their generation, and rightfully so. There has been the Black Lives Matter movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement. Before then, U.S. imperialism as a system that privileges profit and privileges empire and expansionism and the rule of monopolies and the rule of the rich over that of the people, but more specifically, especially the victims, the colonized victims, the oppressed peoples all over the world, and those that reside right here in the colonial borders of the United States, such as Black America. We really wanted to highlight the violence and the consistency and the persistency of that violence, and how it can be drawn, how a thread can be drawn over the course of history in terms of this violence, and how, whether we're looking at the period of slavery, of chattel slavery, or whether we're looking at the history of World War II, or whether we're looking at today in terms of the mass incarceration regime, or the endless war that the United States wages abroad, spending trillions of dollars to do so, we can see that this violence doesn't cease merely because reforms occur to the system, such as the reform of inclusion, including people like Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, so-called oppressed subjects of the United States. Just because you include them within the apparatus of the United States doesn't mean that that violence goes away. Actually, it means it could become more effective, because the ideology of American exceptionalism can be verified in terms of subjectivity, in terms of this notion that there has been some change within the structure, so that change must be progressive. But we have to look at a little more complex, in a little bit of more complex manner, and understand that actually reforms are responses to resistance, and we talk about that, but also we have to understand who actually wields power and control in the United States, and that's not us. That's not the oppressed people. That's not working class people. That's the oligarchy. That's the rich. And unless we dissect the ideologies of the rich, they ultimately infect our movements, and they ultimately push us to frame our positions or to ignore certain things. That's basically why we decided to really counter this notion that violence in the violence of the United States' empire, the violence of capitalism, of the U.S. society as a whole is an aberration, because at the end of the day, when we look at the facts, that's not true. But we also have to look at the ideologies that ultimately erase those facts, especially in this era of so-called fake news, where we put that in the title and we dissect it a little bit, because at the end of the day, who has been the real arbiter of fake news this whole time? And it's been those very forces that are crying about it right now.
You're listening to Danny Haiphong, author with Roberto Sirvent of the new book, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence. And this is Wider View Radio. You talked a little bit about the politics of inclusion, and there are a couple of aspects that you mentioned there that I think deserve a little bit more attention. One is the relationship of identity politics as it's primarily being practiced by the Democratic Party, and how that relates to actual liberation of the people rather than including them in the corporate state. And the other part of that is the relationship between struggles here and the struggles overseas. And that's something I think that a lot of activists here fail to connect.
Yeah, exactly. And they're very interrelated. I would argue the Black Liberation Movement, for example, was internationalist in scope, especially sections of the Black Liberation Movement in the 60s and 70s, like the Black Panther Party, that believed that what the United States did to Black people, lynching, unemployment, police violence, and so on and so forth, that that state, that military state, that racist state, was waging the same forms, the same terror abroad in different forms through, such as the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, and that internationalism has gone missing in this period. And we argue that the politics of inclusion is a big reason why. Because as a response to the Black Liberation Movement, as a response to what was honestly a centuries-long process, beginning with the policy of African slaves to side with enemies of their colonial masters here in the colonies, such as the British, in order to ultimately win freedom, that policy continued. And the response by the ruling class has always been reforms, whether that's through breaking away and creating a white settler republic that could better preserve the system of slavery, or whether that was through in the 1960s and 70s, after that upsurge of Black resistance was ultimately responded to not just by the brutal repression that we also outline in the book from COINTELPRO and the intelligence agencies, but also by beginning to include Black members of society into Congress, into the military state, into halls of corporate power, which then took some of the heat out of the radical elements of the Black resistance movement. And to this day, that has had a huge effect, because ultimately the Black polity, the Black political organizations that have developed over the course of history, they've generally been the most progressive in the United States. They've generally been the most right. They've generally been at the lead of revolutionary movements, not only at the lead, other, working class people, Native people have also had a lot to say about it. But at the end of the day, the Black struggle in the United States has been fundamental to any changes that have occurred in the society for the better. With that struggle being so weak because of these reforms of inclusion, because it is now advertised that the United States has progressed since the Civil Rights Movement by voting in a Black president, for example, or Black city council members, mayors, and the Congressional Black Caucus being another example of this, that there's no need to wage any form of resistance beyond electing members, just like these figures, into the halls of power. And we've seen where that has gotten us. That has gotten us to more effective evils, more effective forms of exploitation, and the reproduction of imperialism in a time where that system, as we note in the beginning of the book and throughout the book, in a time where that system is in dire crisis, where there is a real opportunity, because many people are feeling the contradiction between what the U.S. says about itself versus what it does. There's a real opportunity to revive that spirit of internationalism. But the politics of inclusion, termed by the ruling class as diversity, that political orientation has taken up a lot of room in our spaces and our movement spaces, in place of a real radical orientation and political struggle against empire, which, if we don't wage soon, will be in deep trouble. And we're seeing what that may look like, especially with the Russiagate farce and the provocations toward Russia and China and the endless wars that it seems like every presidential administration, there's another domino that the U.S. is looking to topple in terms of geopolitically. And that only begets more danger in terms of our situation.
Right. Well, one of the reactions, I think, of the activist community has been to forget about national and global issues and concentrate on local issues. What can we do, in our local school system, or can we prevent this or that fossil fuel project from going forward? How can we counter some form of racism, let's say, that's happening in a local environment? But we're not, we're not connecting them to the global, and we're losing sight also, it seems to me, of a more of a class understanding as well of what is causing these issues. Would you agree with that? Or?
I would definitely agree with that on many levels. I think that our book doesn't argue that local struggles are not important, but what I think I would say is that, and I think Glenn Ford talks about this a lot, is that what is the nature of the reform that we're talking about? Because ultimately, when we talk about American exceptionalism and the reforms that the ruling class is willing to concede to, oftentimes those reforms are a negotiation between who has power and who doesn't. And that negotiation often leads to reforms that ultimately benefit the system, ultimately benefit a system like imperialism. And that ultimately is the principal contradiction. It's the principal force and motive that has the most consequences. And so, when we talk about the politics of inclusion, that reform, the reform of diversity, quote unquote, that reform has dire consequences for the people, especially for Black people. But at the end of the day, the benefits that people without power obtain are minimal, especially if we look at the economic condition of Black people or people of color generally in this country. But then we can really discuss this issue of class more deeply when we think about it as well, because class is fundamental, and we are seeing the politics of inclusion being weaponized against any understanding of class and empire, because they're both wholly interrelated. If we understand the U.S. as a class system of capitalism and imperialism, then we can understand that empire is the enemy of everyone who is subject to its oppression, whether that's Black people or whether that's Korean people, whether that's the people all over the continent of Africa who are facing U.S. military occupation at an increasing rate through AFRICOM, whether it's the people of Russia who are the victims of some of the most heinous Russophobia from both political parties in the United States, which is wholly racist at its core. But until we can understand this issue from the question of class and the question of empire, we cannot address these issues. And that's what I think is the fundamental limitation in American exceptionalism, American innocence. These two very interconnected ideologies, they play the role of determining the terrain from which we can discuss these issues. And they do so through endless propaganda in the corporate media in Washington and everywhere that we go, schools. It doesn't matter where we are in the United States. We're going to be bombarded with this notion that at the end of the day, regardless of what changes need to be made or have been made, the United States has become better for it. And I think sometimes, and a lot of the times, our struggles are shaped by this notion that actually the United States as a system is capable of changing in the way that we ideally want it to. And that's because we're still holding on to these values, such as the U.S. as a democratic society, the U.S. as a society that promotes free speech. Both sides of the aisle, left and right, hold on to this ideology, these notions, because they ultimately legitimate their struggles, right? So they legitimate them as opposed to who we should be seeking legitimacy from, and that's from poor and working class people. And so we make the argument that if we don't start there, if we don't start from the oppressed, from the poor, from the working class, then our movements are ultimately always going to reinforce these ideologies of exceptionalism and innocence, because at the end of the day, that's where we're directing our energy to. And so, yeah, our book can be seen as a call to debunking the ideologies and then understanding who we need to be talking to and how we need to be talking to people about these issues, and kind of unlearning a lot of the propaganda and a lot of the lies that we've been told, but also a lot of the ideas and the narratives and the values. I think values are a key struggle, because ultimately that's what the ruling class is throwing at us right now, is values, because they can't throw anything of material substance at us anymore.
Right. Let me ask you the one question here, which I always come to with books that are on the progressive side, and that's it. That many books that I've read outline what's wrong with the United States, and it's always a long list, and their prescription for what needs to change. But they don't explain how we're going to get from where we are now to that nation that we ought to be. So let me throw that question at you. What should people who activists, progressives, people who are woke, as we call them now, what should we be doing to help make change happen?
I think right now, at this moment, given what we're seeing politically, given the Russiagate conspiracy, given the attack on anything Bernie Sanders or left of Bernie Sanders, I think that there are some real ripe conditions to do some deep political education among people who are becoming politicized in this moment. And I think a lot of those people, especially young people, students, but also many workers who are waging heroic struggles in the education system around the teacher struggles against austerity cuts, whether that is in the struggle for Medicare for all, for a Green New Deal. We're seeing polls now coming out for the first time, from what I can remember, where broad majorities of people are showing that they want progressive, quote unquote, progressive changes. They want reforms, and these reforms in this period of endless austerity and war are just untenable to the empire, to the United States empire. And that fundamental contradiction needs to be sharpened. And it needs to, in the one way that we, as people who are so-called woke, but are ultimately trying to put forward a message that can help us better understand what's going on, we need to be doing some serious political education. I think that's, especially in this period of just deepening police state repression over the past 30 years, the economic situation of masses of people. So many people, more than half the population, can't afford a $500 emergency. We're talking about pretty dire economic and political conditions in this country that make it difficult to organize. And I think we need to really hunker down and start doing political education within our communities in order to begin to build a real political struggle that's ideological in character. Because what's missing right now is the fact that few people are saying, well, how do we think about these issues? There's a lot of, we need Medicare for all. We need we need an end to police brutality. But there's not a lot of, why is this happening and how should we think about why this is happening? And until we do, we're not going to breed and develop the leaders that we need to help lead us toward a revolutionary situation, especially when conditions become more ripe, which ultimately they're becoming more ripe, but there will be more crises to come, and there will be wars to come, and we need to be prepared to wage resistance against them. And I think political education is always the first step, and sometimes the step that's overlooked. Actually, a lot of the time it's overlooked.
I mean, one of the messages I get from this book too is that really we cannot make progress and have an empire. We cannot have a military with 800 bases scattered around the world in 130 or more countries, and spend $1 trillion or more a year on weaponry, and then also deal with healthcare, education, the environmental needs that we have, our broken infrastructure. I mean, all the many things that need to be fixed. We can't do both. If we don't understand the relationship between those two, we're never going to make the progress that we need to make.
Exactly. And, whether it's John Brennan or Pompeo, it doesn't matter really. And that's what this ultimately reflects, is that, we can't have the nice things. We can't have the progressive changes, because ultimately those progressive changes require transformation, a social transformation, a real transformation of how things operate and how things are organized, how politics are organized, and how the economy is organized. Until we answer those questions, we can't have those things, because ultimately what the military state and what the warfare state, what the U.S. imperialist state ultimately shows, is that there is a group of people that ultimately rule over a global system. They are fundamentally interested only in the profits that they derive from however they acquire them, through exploitation of labor, through wars, through usurpation of land. That is the fundamental contradiction of the system that we have now. And until we change that, until we alter that fundamental contradiction, until we overthrow it through a new system, we're not going to get healthcare for all right away. When as Sanders announced his campaign, you had Nancy Pelosi meeting with some of the top oligarchs in the health insurance industry, promising them that Medicare for all would never become a policy. So you have this duplicity and this reality. These institutions really want to build an empire that makes a few people rich at the expense of the many.
Thanks again to Danny Haiphong for speaking with me today. You can find a link to his book and his articles on Black Agenda Report in the show notes at widerviewradio.podbean.com. The views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests, and may not reflect the views of the management of the radio station to which you're listening. Our aim is to provoke you to think outside the box, to question the narratives you hear from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we have succeeded. Your comments and questions are welcome. Please direct them to widerviewradio@gmail.com. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.